Public Observatory Night from the Center for Astrophysics, Harvard and Smithsonian. My name is Sarah Hogan, and I'm the Donor Relations and Events Manager at the CFA, and I will be your host this evening. While we would rather be with you all in person tonight, we're grateful for the opportunity to present tonight's topic in a webinar format. All audience members have their video turned off and their microphones muted. If you'd like to ask a question during the presentation, please type it into the Q&A section at the bottom right hand of your screen. I'll read as many questions as time will allow at the end of the talk. If you're interested in receiving our e-newsletter and information about upcoming events, please make sure to sign up for our mailing list by clicking on the link in the chat section. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Josh Grindley, who's the Robert Treat Payne Professor of Astronomy at Harvard University and will be introducing tonight's speaker.
I'm very pleased to introduce tonight's speaker, Donovan Moore, who has written an absolutely wonderful book, and you are all in for a treat to hear about this firsthand from the author. Donovan has written for a number of newspapers and magazines. He's written for The Globe, Rolling Stone, and other esteemed publications. He's worked as a television reporter and producer and as a private banker. Donovan has an undergraduate degree in mathematics from Duke University, and a master's degree from the Sloan School of Management at MIT. And he resides in Brooklyn Heights, New York, and also Sausalito, California, which I suspect Donovan is not visiting too much at the moment, but we'll hope that things are doing better out there. But in any case, as I said at the beginning, this book is absolutely superb in my view. And I'm going to tell you a few, if there's time at the end, very short accounts of Cecilia, the star of the book, as you all know, because I did know her when I was a graduate student here back in the 70s. But let me not take any more time now and introduce you to Donovan Moore to tell us about what stars are made of, his profound biography of Cecilia Payne-Gaposchkin. Donovan.
I have to say, this is quite a thrill for me to do an event with the Harvard Observatory. It was a special place for Cecilia, and as I researched the book, it became a special place for me. So thank you also to Sarah Hogan, Catherine Copeland, and Mary Claire O'Neill from the Center for Astrophysics. And a special thanks to Owen Gingrich. As most of you know, or many of you know, Owen is a most patient professor at the observatory, in whose office I spent many hours asking countless questions. And thank you all for tuning in. This was supposed to be an on-site event. That's of course not happening now, but these video events do seem to work. I did one for the Harvard bookstore about a month ago, and the moderator there said something very interesting. She said, in these author videos, everybody has the same good seat. So I kind of like that. Now, I read recently that when you're stuck at home, it's good to find ways to interact. You feel better when you participate. So as we go through this presentation, I encourage you to write down your questions, submit them. We'll do a brief Q&A at the end. Okay, with that in mind, grab your wine. I've got mine. And let's get started. Okay. Okay. I trust the book cover is on the screen. So whenever I tell someone that I've written a book, a biography of a woman scientist, the first question, without fail, is how did you get that idea? And I'll bet that's what many of you are thinking tonight. So let me tell you. Years ago, before I sold out to Wall Street, I used to write, as Josh said, the Boston Globe, Rolling Stone, newspaper and magazine pieces, now and then a screenplay. They were all bought. None of them was made. It was very frustrating. But what I always wanted to write was a book. So in the spring of 2016, I took a friend, Lanny Jones, to lunch. Lanny had retired as the managing editor of People magazine, and he had written a biography, and I wanted to talk to him about the isolation of research, how do you handle it, things like that. Lanny knew I had an interest in science and technology, and he said he would send me the materials from a course he was auditing at Princeton. It was David Spergel's course called The Universe. So he did. And as I'm leafing through the presentation, the course materials, I came upon a page with 3 photographs. No names, just 3 photographs. I recognized the 2 men, Aristotle and Newton. Who's the woman? Literally on the same page as these eminent scientists. It was, of course, Cecilia Payne. I was intrigued, so I started to poke around. First, there was that photograph. It wasn't a picture of Cecilia herself. It was of her oil portrait. Patricia Watwood, an American portraitist, had painted it from a montage of 25 separate photos. She had based it on the Astronomer, the 1668 Vermeer oil on canvas that hangs today in the Louvre. The portrait was commissioned in 2002 by Dudley Hirschbach, Nobel-winning professor of chemistry at Harvard, and his wife, Georgine. Now, I'll tell you more about this in a few minutes, and Josh will have some information to give at the end of the presentation as well. At the dedication ceremony for the portrait, Jeremy Knowles, Dean of the Harvard Faculty of Arts and Sciences, said, "Every high school student knows that Newton discovered gravity, that Darwin discovered evolution, even that Einstein discovered relativity. But when it comes to the composition of our universe, the textbooks simply say that the most prevalent element in the universe is hydrogen, and no one ever wonders how we know." Now I'm really intrigued. I kept poking, and what I found was this amazingly inspirational story of a woman who had to overcome unbelievable obstacles, personal, academic, professional, to make one of the most fundamental discoveries in all of science. And no one had written a book about her. So I retired from private banking. I hate that word. I like to say I changed jobs. I started to research. I read Cecilia's memoir. I traveled to Cambridge, England, where I rode a bicycle all over the university day and night because I wanted to know what it was like for Cecilia in the 1920s. And I studied old photographs. Cecilia was born in 1900 in Wendover, a small British village 40 miles northwest of London. Her father, Edward, died when she was only 4 years old. She was raised by her mother, Emma. And early on, she had a relentless curiosity. That's Cecilia on the right with her brother and sister. When she won a botany contest, she got to choose any book she wanted that would be then bound in leather. The school, of course, expected her to choose Shakespeare, maybe Milton. She chose a book on fungi. She had little patience for organized religion. She once asked a London bookbinder to put a fake cover on the Apology and inscribe Holy Bible on the spine so that her teachers would think she was working on her religion studies instead of reading Plato. The bookbinder refused to do it. It was an attitude that finally got her expelled at 16 with just 1 year of school left before college. Most girls at the time went to a finishing school to get prepared for marriage. Luckily for Cecilia and for science, she was accepted to St. Paul's School for Girls in London. This was no finishing school. It was serious, and it was a school made for her. The minute she walked in the door, she said to herself, "I shall never be lonely again. Now I can think about science." Her goal was to go to Cambridge University, so she spent that last year studying all the time. Newtonian equations of motion, thermodynamics, astronomy. It was a wild year, and she did it. She was accepted to Cambridge on a scholarship in the fall of 1919. Now, Cambridge had been, for 700 years, strictly all men. In 1865, when women started making noises about going to Cambridge, a geology professor at the time pronounced them to be nasty forward minxes. It was not until 1871 that women were finally accepted to the university. When Cecilia, neither nasty nor a minx, but definitely forward, enrolled, she was a freshman at Newnham, one of 2 colleges for women at Cambridge. It was understood at the time that men studied mathematics, women majored in botany. So she dutifully checked the botany box with physics as a minor. Everything changed, though, after only a few months when this man came back into town. His name is Arthur Eddington. With his starched collar, his perfectly knotted silk tie, the pince-nez, the hint of a smile, he looked like he knew more about whatever you were going to say than you did. He was a supremely confident man. This is how he opened chapter 11 of his book, Philosophy of Physical Science. I believe there are, whatever that number is, protons in the universe and the same number of electrons. Eddington was director of the Cambridge Observatory, and he had just returned from Principe off the coast of Africa. He had gone there in May of 1919 to demonstrate the validity of Einstein's theory of relativity by photographing a solar eclipse. You'll have to read the book to get the details, but suffice to say, he did it. The New York Times, on short notice, assigned the coverage to Henry Crouch, the paper's golf reporter. It was said at the time that Henry would have been the first to admit that he was not an authority on the mathematics of four-dimensional space-time. But Henry did perceive that something extraordinary had taken place. Eddington came back to Cambridge in December of that year to give a lecture on the results of his solar expedition. I put this slide in to show you the scale of things at Cambridge. This is the entrance to the dining hall at Trinity College. People apparently were much shorter back then. So Eddington strides into the Trinity dining hall to give his lecture, and it was all anyone could talk about. By anyone, I mean men. There were only 4 women in the audience. One of the original 4 couldn't go, so she gave her ticket to Cecilia. That woman, lost to history, could not have foreseen that it would mark a turning point in Cecilia's life. After Eddington finished, she raced back to her room and transcribed his lecture word for word into a notebook. She recalled at the time, "For 3 nights, I think I did not sleep. My world had been so shaken that I experienced something like a nervous breakdown." She was done with botany. She switched her major to physics with all the astronomy she could pick up on the side. Now, physics was taught at the famed Cavendish Laboratory. To study physics back then, you had to use your hands to work with glass tubes and wires and electrical coils. At Cambridge, however, mathematics ruled, and mathematicians worked with their minds. They decidedly did not work with their hands. So the physicists at Cambridge had to disguise where they worked, and often the best place to hide something is right in plain sight. Thus, the Cavendish Lab, the birthplace of modern physics, where scientists ultimately would conduct experiments in nuclear fission, was not located somewhere out in the countryside, but right in the middle of town, behind a Gothic entrance with 18-inch walls, and where the window boxes held not flowers, but helioscopes that drove sunlight into the lab. To get to the lab from Newnham, Cecilia had to have 2 things, a bicycle and a hat. Before a woman could enter the center of town, she had to have her head covered. I don't have a picture of Cecilia then. You will just have to imagine a young woman on a bike in Edwardian dress, wearing the required hat and avoiding horse droppings as she crossed the River Cam on a cold winter morning. Now, physics was taught in the Maxwell Lecture Theater, a cavernous room with a 28-foot ceiling and wooden plank floors. Because Cecilia was a woman, the only woman in a class of 30, she had to sit in the front row. The physics professor was also the head of the lab, Ernest Rutherford. Before he became a physicist, he had won the 1908 Nobel Prize in chemistry. He would gaze directly at Cecilia and begin each lecture with, "Ladies and gentlemen." Cecilia would remember that all the boys regularly greeted this witticism with thunderous applause, stamping with their feet in the traditional manner, and at every lecture, I wished I could sink into the earth. When she wasn't at the Cav lab, she could be found in an observatory. First, she discovered the little one out back of her dorm, the Newnham Observatory. Now, I took this picture, and I can tell you, it is literally just a hut housing a telescope, a small telescope. She snuck out one night, opened the hatch, fixed the clock that kept the telescope aimed correctly, and then installed a notebook with instructions that observers had to record their findings with a signature and a date. Her closest friend at Newnham, another freshman named Betty Leaf, wrote in the school newspaper that Cecilia was now to be found on starry nights among the moths and dust of Newnham Observatory, showing the wonders of the heavens to all who come. Now, there was, of course, another observatory. The Cambridge Observatory was a 10-minute bicycle ride away. When it was open to the public, Cecilia would bike there at night. It was very safe. This was Cambridge University. No one gave a second look to a young woman in Edwardian dress pedaling hard up Mattingly Road. This is what it looked like then. This is the observatory today. Nothing much has changed. This observatory had a considerably bigger telescope. It was known as the Sheepshanks telescope, a 12.5-inch refractor. One night she asked so many penetrating questions that the assistant, poor little Henry Green, ran out of the observatory, scurried into the main building, and told the director that he needed help. "Sir," he said, "there's a woman out there asking questions." The sir he was referring to was Arthur Eddington. Excuse me. When Eddington walked over to the telescope, Cecilia wasted no time in telling him that she wished to be an astronomer. His rather laconic response was, "I see no insuperable objection." When she later said the same thing to F.J.M. Stratton, a lecturer in astrophysics, his response was, "You can never hope to be anything but an amateur." Now, Cecilia endured these kinds of comments, endured derision in the classroom because of the timing. She was learning physics from the very scientists, Rutherford, Eddington, Niels Bohr, who were making great discoveries. As her friend Betty Leaf put it, she is most completely happy when some beautiful mathematical theory of the universe makes her forget the minor disturbances of everyday life. As Cecilia's 4 years at Cambridge wound down, she had to figure out what to do upon graduating. She got help from this man, Leslie L.J. Comrie. He was a character. He lost a leg in World War I, yet still played a mean game of tennis. He was an expert in computational astronomy, of whom it was said that he did not make allowances for the frailties of others and was far from tactful in pointing them out. He was a demanding mentor to Cecilia. Under his guidance, she assembled her own personal set of mathematical tables. And it was LJ who took her to the British Astronomical Association in London as his guest to listen to a lecture given by Harlow Shapley, the director of the Harvard College Observatory. Afterwards, Cecilia went back to her dorm and, as she had done after listening to Eddington, transcribed Shapley's lecture into a notebook, word for word. With absolutely no prospects for an astronomy job in England, she began a handwritten correspondence with Shapley. First, a heartfelt letter seeking a job at the Harvard Observatory, followed by, when Shapley expressed interest, her qualifications. And if you look at these letters, you see hardly any scratched out word or mistake. She probably took her several drafts to get it like this. And it worked. She got Shapley to offer her a fellowship for a year's work at Harvard. She packed her clothes in a trunk and boarded a Cunard liner bound for the United States. She put a snapshot of her friend Betty Leaf in her wallet. Now, what's happening here is this: physics as a form of scientific study is emerging, and physics was now being combined with other disciplines to make great discoveries. Rutherford was fusing physics with chemistry to understand the nucleus of an atom. Bohr was fusing physics with the quantum theory to study molecular structure. Einstein was fusing physics with mathematics to produce his theory of relativity. So might young woman graduate student Cecilia Payne be able to fuse physics with astronomy to understand the known universe, to determine what stars are made of? Okay, for the 2 or 3 of you out there who don't know the answer, let's find out. I must confess that in Massachusetts, I have found a stony-hearted stepmother. That's how Cecilia described where she had landed in the fall of 1923. The Harvard College Observatory was located on Concord Avenue at the northwest edge of the campus. High up on a hill, its windows glowing deep into the night, it was unlike any other building. Cecilia's daughter, Catherine, remembers it had a spookily delightful spiral staircase, a creaky dumbwaiter, and a dusty catacomb. A number of women were employed at the observatory before Cecilia got there: Wilhelmina Fleming, Antonia Mori, Annie Jump Cannon, Henrietta Leavitt. They were known as computers, and their job was to observe and catalog every star that the observatory's telescope could find. They did an amazing job. They produced 9 250-page volumes of stellar classifications. Cecilia knew just 2 of them. She would work late at night with Antonio Mari, that's her in the upper right, who insisted on keeping the windows open so the 2 of them were bitten unmercifully by mosquitoes, and Annie Cannon, lower left, who could classify spectra at the astonishing rate of 300 stars every hour. They didn't do it all alone, however. There were a number of assistants with their own idiosyncrasies. There was Louisa Wells, who Cecilia remembered as sitting at her desk, marking stars on a glass plate, and then falling asleep and rubbing all the marks off with her nose. and Edward King, who admonished Cecilia to never record the timing of ending an exposure until the shutter had actually been closed. One might die in the interval, and the record would then be inaccurate. There are so many wonderful oddball characters in this story, I can only touch on a few of them. But that's all the computers did, classify. They didn't try to analyze or understand. It's like they stocked a library with hundreds of thousands of books and didn't read any of them. There were two reasons. First, that wasn't their job. And second, none of the computers had been trained in physics and in astronomy as Cecilia had been. They just collected specimens, that's all. They were a quirky bunch of characters, but to Cecilia, far from her mother, far from her brother and sister, far from home, they soon became like family. Now it was time to put all her Cavendish Lab learning to work. First stop was the office of Harlow Shapley, the director of the observatory and the man who hired her. Shapley thought he was getting another hardworking computer. He was wrong. She reminded him that she was on a fellowship. She was technically not an employee. Shapley then asked, well, what did she want to do? All those stellar spectra on glass plates, they were like a million jigsaw puzzle pieces waiting for someone to put them together. She said she wanted to focus her Cavendish Lab training on what was stored away in those dusty catacombs. In other words, introduce astrophysics to the Harvard College Observatory. Shapley may not have been able to dictate what Cecilia would do during her fellowship, but he was a smart man. The observatory had always been more or less an outpost. He was determined to create a true Department of Astronomy at Harvard. But to do that, he would need a doctoral candidate. He told Cecilia she could have her run of the place. All she had to do was write a thesis. Neither of them knew at the time what a momentous thing that would turn out to be. So Cecilia now turned her trained eye on all those glass plates. At first, she described them as little more than tiny parallel smears. How was she supposed to apply astrophysics to smears? Another obstacle, which is exactly when the smears started to make sense. Now, when I'm doing a presentation at a bookstore, I usually say here, you and I can't see it, but she could. It occurs to me that many of you in this audience actually can see it. Silicon first, then carbon. She could see a relationship between ionization levels and temperature. Finally, she wrote later, some light dawned in the darkness. But as she worked her way down the periodic table, she could see that stars were composed mostly of hydrogen, like 1,000,000 times more hydrogen than the astronomical community had assumed. It was heresy. From Eddington on down, the established men of science believed that stars were composed of the same elements as Earth and in roughly the same proportions. Heated up Earths, if you will. These are two of the established men, Shapley on the right and Henry Norris Russell on the left. Russell was the director of the Princeton Observatory and the dean of American astronomers. When he read a draft of Cecilia's thesis, he felt compelled to warn her. There is something seriously wrong with the present theory, he wrote to Cecilia. It is clearly impossible that hydrogen should be 1,000,000 times more abundant than the metals. She was cornered now. In order to get her thesis, Stellar Atmospheres, published, as demanded by Shapley, she had to accommodate Russell. So she hedged. She described her conclusion that hydrogen dominated the composition of stars as almost certainly not real. Almost certainly. As historian David Dvorkin described it, she was crafty, choosing her words in a manner that was designed to record for posterity that she was the first to make this observation, right or wrong. In so doing, Payne can be credited with profound political acumen. She always regretted it, is what Cecilia's daughter Catherine told me in an interview, talking about Cecilia's decision to deny the results of her research. She didn't dwell on it, Catherine said, but throughout her life, she lamented that decision. Now, of course, in hindsight, it's clear that Cecilia, looking down at those slides, had done what astronomers had tried to do for centuries by looking up, determine what stars are made of, one of the most fundamental of all scientific discoveries. Her findings were dismissed because the veteran astronomers at the time did not have the same training in physics that she had. In other words, they could not peer as deeply into the universe as she could. With the thesis complete, Cecilia could finally come up for air, live a little, as she put it. Her best friend at the observatory was Adelaide Ames, another young researcher. They were so close that they came to be known as the Heavenly Twins. Adelaide worked as Shapley's assistant. She was very much under his thumb and unavailable. So when Cecilia decided to drive cross country, she took her roommate along, Frances Wright. That's her in the center. They took Cecilia's car. She had saved up enough money to buy a 1930 Model T. Around this time, Cecilia crossed paths with this man, Norbert Wiener. Norbert would become a mathematics professor at MIT. He was known for stopping in on fellow professors, knocking off his cigar ashes in the blackboard tray, and then asking which way had he come in. When he got the answer, he would say, "Oh, good, that means I've had lunch." He and Cecilia met on board ship during one of Cecilia's trips back to England. 31-year-old Norbert fell madly in love with 25-year-old Cecilia. He wrote to his mother, "As you know, we are going back on the same boat. A lot can happen on a boat." Poor Norbert, a lot didn't happen. The more he pressed, the more Cecilia backed away. She was living in America now. She was going to have a career as a scientist and not just be the supportive wife of an irrepressible professor. Meanwhile, there was a crack in the wall of belief that earthly metals were the principal elements of stars. 4 years after Cecilia's thesis was published, Norris Russell, the man who told her she was wrong, finally concluded that hydrogen is far more abundant than the other metals. His research agreed with Cecilia's, but he buried that fact toward the end of the paper he published. He got the credit at the time because, as historian David Dvorkin puts it, he knew what the community would accept. Cecilia was teaching astronomy courses now, although her name was not listed in the Harvard course catalog. She did have her own apartment, but her salary was regrettable. She was paid out of Shapley's equipment budget. But the steadiness was tempered by sadness. 10 years after arriving at Harvard, she learned that her close friend at Cambridge, Betty Leaf, had drowned. She would not be the only one. Adelaide had been on a lake when a storm tossed her out of a canoe. She soon disappeared. Shapley himself took charge of the search. It took 10 days to recover the body. Cecilia was devastated. "Adelaide and Betty were dead and I was alive," she wrote later. "I was absorbed in my work, shy and unattractive. I made a silent resolve. I would embrace life." She needed to get away from the US, away from the observatory. She didn't do what probably you and I would do in the dead of winter, go to a beach somewhere. Instead, she went first to Pulkovo, a remote observatory on the outskirts of St. Petersburg in Russia, and then by train to Lower Saxony in Germany for a meeting of the German Astronomical Society. As she was sitting in the back of the auditorium, a conference official with a bundle of mail in his arms walked by calling out, "Miss Payne, Miss Payne." After she identified herself, a young man approached. His name was Sergey Gaposchkin. He was there to meet the renowned American astronomer, Cecilia Payne. He was obviously taken aback. Because of her reputation, Cecilia later recalled that he had expected that Miss Payne would be a little old lady and was surprised to find her no older than himself. Sergey told her that he was a Russian astronomer in Berlin. He couldn't stay in Germany and he couldn't return to Russia. He gave her a handwritten account of his life and asked, could she help him? On the train back to Cambridge, August 12, 1933, she took out a paper and pen and wrote a 6-page letter to Shapley about Sergey. It was classic Cecilia, detailed, thorough, organized. There was also something else, something missing from all her other correspondence. It was emotional. I am not ashamed to confess that I literally passed a sleepless night after my first talk with him. He came from Berlin to Göttingen on his bicycle, 4 days' journey, carrying his provisions with him. I shall long remember how we walked up the main street, Gaposchkin nervously giving the salute to passing brown shirts. He is small but strong and of a happy, ! disposition. Forgive me if I speak strongly. It is not a rash impulse and it comes from the heart. She traveled to Washington to push for a visa for Sergey. She pressured Shapley to hire him. She was typically relentless. It worked. By December, Sergey had his own desk at the Harvard Observatory. And 3 months later, they slipped away to New York, where, as Cecilia described it, in March 1934, I became Cecilia Payne-Gaposchkin. Their disappearance and marriage was a surprise to the astronomical community. One story, undoubtedly a myth, was that upon hearing the news, Annie Cannon fainted dead away. It was Henry Norris Russell, though, who best captured the mood. I sincerely hope that it turns out splendidly, he wrote in a letter, but I keep wondering how it happened. As the years went by, there were changes in Cecilia's life. One was that she and Sergey had children, 3 altogether. Some things, though, did not change. Although she taught many astronomy classes, she remained relatively anonymous. It was Shapley who told her why. Abbot Lawrence Lowell, the president of Harvard, had told him years earlier that because she was a woman, Miss Payne should never have a position in the university as long as he was alive. Another change came in 1954. Donald Menzel replaced Harlow Shapley as director of the Harvard Observatory. One of the first things he did was to double Cecilia's salary. And with Lowell no longer president of the university, he made another change. The New York Times, June 21st, 1956. Harvard University announced today the appointment of Dr. Cecilia Payne-Gaposchkin as professor of astronomy. She is the first woman to attain full professorship at Harvard through regular faculty promotion. About her appointment, Cecilia wrote later, "I have reached a height that I should never in my wildest dreams have predicted 50 years ago." Sadly, one of the things that did not change in all those years was Cecilia's smoking habit. Harvard professor Owen Gingrich, a student of Cecilia's, described it best. A pack of cigarettes and a single match could get her through the entire period. It caught up with her finally. Cecilia died of lung cancer in December 1979. In searching for an ending quote to describe this woman who was so captivated by the simple thrill of discovery, I thought the best was a bit of advice she once gave. She was talking to students who were considering science, but her words apply to everyone who feels the need to understand. Do not undertake a scientific career in quest of fame or money. There are easier and better ways to reach them. Undertake it only if nothing else will satisfy you, for nothing else is probably what you will receive. Your reward will be the widening of the horizon as you climb, and if you achieve that reward, you will ask no other. Okay, now, as promised, back to that portrait. The portrait hangs in University Hall, which means that Cecilia's presence is in the room today for many an important meeting at Harvard. University Hall contains portraits of a number of important figures in the university's history. Here's another one. Abbot Lawrence Lowell, the 22nd president of Harvard University, the same man who once said that Cecilia Payne should never have a position in the university as long as he was alive. Surely Cecilia would appreciate the irony. Her eyes are looking left and slightly up, meaning she now gazes at him on that very same wall, no more than 30 feet away. Okay, that's it. I will stop sharing now, and I guess we'll come back to Josh and to Sarah. Hello, Sarah.
Hello. So we actually have a few questions to start. Just a reminder, if you have questions, please type them into the Q&A box that's at the lower right hand of your screen. The first question is, to your knowledge, did Dr. Payne-Gaposchkin ever meet Marie Curie?
Not to my knowledge, and I researched it to death, so I think I probably would have seen that, but I don't think so, but if someone knows better, they should chime in.
Do you know, Josh?
No, I don't know. It's possible, I suppose, but I don't know how they would have overlapped. So I can't say.
Next question. What was the remainder of her research about, and were there any more spectacular findings?
Yeah. After she, after her wedding, and now she was an employee, not on a fellowship anymore, Shapley could assign her what to do. And so he assigned her to study variable stars, to catalog variable stars. And Cecilia, she liked to say her discovery drew on her imagination and her sense of analysis. Categorizing variable stars did not. So it was kind of, she called it stellar drudgery, I think. But she attacked it in typical relentless fashion. And I think she made about 2 million observations, hundreds of thousands of variable stars. And Sergey worked with her on that. They split it up. He took, I think, binary eclipsing stars, and she took all the rest. And they put it all together, and they actually wrote a book together called Variable Stars. So she could find the challenge in anything.
Very good. Josh, I think this one might be for you.
Okay.
I'm a high school senior in Massachusetts, and I plan to major in astrophysics or physics next year in college. What advice would you have in terms of being successful in this field?
Go for it. It's the right time to do astrophysics. Discoveries are being made all the time. As Cecilia would, it's a shame she's not around to know what's happened after she left off being an active researcher. But it's a very active field, and so whoever this high school student is, I strongly encourage that he pursue his interest and apply.
Or she.
Sorry, or she, yes.
I said he or she.
I certainly agree. Yeah, let me just jump in here very briefly on what Donovan was just saying about her later work. She and Sergey became the real experts on the most extreme variable stars, which were called novae, not supernovae, which many will have heard something about, but things that are new stars, just the very definition of novae, that were, because of work that Cecilia and others here were doing, could be measured in their fundamental properties. And so what Cecilia did was really the first thorough investigation of very luminous transients, which is in fact something that I'm very interested in, and lots of people are. And it's interesting to think that some of the novae, which we understand quite thoroughly by now how they work and what makes them all of a sudden become literally 1 million times brighter than they were, the day or a few days before. It's an enormous nuclear outburst on the surface of a collapsed star, a white dwarf. But it's interesting to think that some of what Cecilia found may have been not white dwarfs at all, but black holes. And now this was long before black holes were discovered. But in some ways, her work on novae and these extreme variables led to the discovery of black holes 20 years later. If you like, well, maybe we should finish the questions first. So, but otherwise I could show this briefly, this picture of the portrait that Donovan mentioned.
Sure, why don't you show it briefly and I'll continue with the questions afterwards.
We'll do a screen share here. And here it is. Can everybody see this?
Yes.
So this is what we all wish, those of you there on the meeting here could have seen for yourselves in the lobby of our building, our entrance of our lobby, in fact, where here's this wonderful portrait. I'm pointing at it with a mouse. I'm sorry, this label here about screen sharing is, at least for me, partially blocking the view of Cecilia, but it's a wonderful reproduction of the painting, very high resolution, made by the Fogg Museum. And here are the donors. Dudley Hirschbach and his wife, Georgine. She was the registrar at Harvard for many years, a very distinguished position. And Dudley, as Donovan said, Nobel Prize winner in chemistry. And what was the occasion of this photograph? It was from May of this year, if I'm getting the month right, but I think it was May, when we at the CFA hold our annual Cecilia Payne-Gaposchkin lecture to honor Cecilia, who we all recognize as a truly fundamental astrophysicist. And so the speaker this year was Jocelyn Bell, who, when you read Donovan's book, which I strongly encourage you to do, you will find that she wrote the foreword for the book, and it was very appropriate that Donovan chose her. I'm not going to tell you why. You have to read that book to see. But Jocelyn is an incredible figure in science today. She is the discoverer of pulsars. And I suspect many in the audience will have heard about pulsars, but she discovered the first one back in 1967. I remember I was a graduate student at the time, and this was one of the most exciting things I'd ever heard of. And she should have won a Nobel Prize, but alas, that was the day when women were still not being recognized as they should. And her thesis advisor got the Nobel Prize instead of her. And that's something that all of astronomy feels very bad about. But in any case, we all recognize who the real prize winner is or was. So let me stop there. I could say just a very quick word about the portrait. My wife, Sandra Grindley, was the curator of the Harvard Portrait Collection back when Dudley and his wife had this wonderful idea about having a portrait commissioned of Cecilia. There's another whole part of this Cecilia story that I don't think is in Donovan's book. At least I haven't seen it in there, and there's no reason it should be. But it's Dudley's interest in astronomy as opposed to chemistry. Well, chemistry, as you've heard from Donovan, is a key part of astronomy, understanding the elements. But Dudley was so enamored of Cecilia that he wanted to donate a portrait because at the time, at Dudley's suggestion, the Harvard faculty room contained no portraits of women. And this is yikes. I wish Sandy were in the room here. She's in another room watching this, but I think this was round about 1970. Well, let's not worry about the exact date. So the portrait was to be done, and just very quickly to finish this already too long story, Sandy found Patricia Watwood, a young beginning at her early stages in her career, portrait painter in New York, and commissioned her, the Fogg Museum, the Harvard Art Museum, commissioned Patricia to do this. And it's a truly wonderful portrait. As Donovan said, you think of Vermeer when you see it, but it's Cecilia. So it's a great fitting tribute to Cecilia. And to just one more comment on why do we have this annual lecture? Well, I've mentioned it already, but we have the Cecilia Payne-Gaposchkin lecture every year to honor a true hero in the history of astronomy and astrophysics. Let me stop there.
This question is, I think, for Donovan. Does the book cover her science as well as her life story, or is it mostly her life story?
It is both. I tried to actually split it into both halves because I wanted the book to be, not just a textbook. It could be used for sure as an astrophysics or astronomy text, but I wanted it to be more than that. So I spent a good bit of time on her science, but also on her on her life story. And it really worked. There's a wonderful review, if I can find it here, of the book. It was by Marcia Bartusiak in the Wall Street Journal, and she said this: handling the science with a light but deft touch. I like that. Light but deft touch. Mr. Moore primarily focuses on this astronomer's personal life, the office politics, and the struggles one woman of science faced in the first half of the 20th century. So that's really what I was trying to do, is to write a book that was both scientifically and historically accurate, but also a narrative that would be easily read.
Did any of her children inherit her intellectual gifts and love of science and pursue a scientific career?
Yeah, well, yes. Her daughter, Catherine, was a science technical writer, and I think she worked for Hewlett-Packard. And her son, Mike, I believe, was also in the sciences. She had another son, Peter, and he died recently. He was I think he was a professor at Berkeley. But what's really interesting is Edward's daughter, Cecilia's granddaughter, is named Cecilia, and her name is Cecilia Gaposchkin. And she is a professor at Dartmouth. And I've been in touch with her. She liked the book, fortunately. And I think we're going to try to do a joint presentation, probably at Dartmouth. Cecilia's biographer and Cecilia's granddaughter. It would make for a very interesting presentation, I think.
If Cecilia was alive now, what aspect of astrophysics do you believe that she would focus her observation skills on?
Yeah. Well, look, she was a relentlessly curious person. So whatever is the topic that demanded research and analysis, that's what she would be after. Now, dark matter and dark energy, of course, are prime subjects now in astronomy. And I think she would probably be at work on that. But whatever it is, she would go after it. She was an amazingly interesting, intellectually gifted woman. That's sort of why I wrote the book. If I could, get off topic a little bit. When I wrote it, I was not a scientist. I was not an historian. I was just a writer. And I really didn't need to write the book. I wasn't a professor under the gun of publish or perish or, an activist with a mission to push. I was just this lowly writer looking for a good story. But I think my not having an agenda is what gives the book its power, because I wrote it simply because it was such a compelling story. Her relentless need to know, that's what drove her, was so appealing to me. Derided in class, paid poorly, denied teaching credit, told she was wrong. None of those things mattered. She just stepped on them if they got in the way. There's a wonderful quote in the book. If you can give me a second, I want to just read you this quote. It's in the author's note. I quote Richard Forte. He's an English paleontologist who captured so eloquently the simple thrill of discovery. Listen to this. The excitement of discovery cannot be bought or faked. It provokes a whoop of enthusiasm that can banish frozen fingers from consideration and make a long day too short. Oh man, I just love that. Make a long day too short. So that's it. The hunt for discovery, the need to know when all your long days are too short. That's really what the book is about. So on one level, it is a well-researched biography. Harvard Press, I assure you, would not publish a book that didn't have scientific rigor and historical accuracy. But on another level, it's a narrative, getting back to that, about the basic human need to understand, to figure out. And exploring that's what brings the book to a level that's more than just a recounting of someone's life.
This may be a very short answer. Did Russell ever apologize to Cecilia for doubting her results?
No, he did not. He, as I said in the presentation, he buried it on page, I think, 79 of the paper that he wrote. And so, David Dvorkin is right. He's the curator at the Smithsonian Institution, and he was a reviewer of the manuscript. He said, the credit goes to the one who sways the community. In fact, I think even Owen Gingrich said the same thing. So Russell knew what the community would accept, so the credit flowed to him.
With her presence at Harvard, how did Cecilia influence the work and careers of the Harvard computers?
Well, as I said, she only knew two of them, Antonia Mari and Annie Jump Cannon. Shapley said to her one time, it's in the book, it's very interesting. He said, Cecilia, Annie could throw a monkey wrench into whatever you were doing, because she had great stature at the observatory and she was a very classy lady. She sometimes would wear a string of pearls as she classified stars. So Cecilia was very careful to tiptoe lightly around Annie. Antonia Mori was different. She was, kind of a irritant sometimes to most of the people in the observatory, but Annie Cannon was different. So I don't know that Cecilia influenced them, but they certainly influenced her with the detail of their work.
This question asks, have you seen the recent Cosmos TV episode in which Cecilia's story was featured, and did you feel that this characterization of her life was accurate?
Ooh, this is going to be a very short answer. No, I didn't see this. I didn't.
No.
I don't know. I mean, there's a fair amount of good research on Cecilia, and of course her memoir is very good. So if they use those materials, it has to be pretty accurate. That's what I would say.
Are her classifications still used in databases like Simbad for current research? This might be a Josh question.
Well, yes. I mean, the fundamental stellar classification system was done by the hard work of the computers, as Donovan said, in a strictly empirical way. But Cecilia is the one who brought physical understanding to what it meant. And so if one looking at the type of star in Simbad would know that this is an type F main sequence star or a very cool M dwarf or whatever, they wouldn't find a direct reference to Cecilia, nor to the computers per se, Antonia Mori or Annie Jump Cannon in particular, but this is where it all came from. So the short answer is yes, it wouldn't have happened otherwise.
Donovan, given that she's such an important historical scientific figure, why do you think that there has been no previous biography written about her life?
Yeah. Look, I wondered the same thing. I don't know the answer. Lucky me that there hasn't been one. It might have been that she was British and came to this country to do her work. I don't know, because the story of her discovery is terrific, but she herself was also a most interesting person. She was just so curious about everything. You had to, I found myself liking her more and more as I did the research. I don't know why there hasn't been. There should have been, but as I said, lucky for me, it wasn't.
Were there any famous female astronomers that she taught that you know of?
This is probably a good question for Josh also, but she was influenced by some. Mariah Mitchell at Vassar and a couple of other female scientists. The problem for Cecilia was there weren't many women astronomers at the time. There were no hashtags, if you will, to get support from. So she had to pretty much go it alone. Now they did do, a lot of astronomers flowed through the observatory. I guess maybe Josh could handle it, but there was another woman who was, I can't remember her name right now, but there was another woman who came through, but I don't know that if she taught any. Josh, do you know?
I don't either. By the time when I knew her, just in the last few years of her life, she had long since retired from teaching, wasn't supervising students. But we all knew how incredible she was. And so I can think of one fellow graduate student, she was a year or so ahead of me, but we were roughly at the same stage, Sandy Faber, who the astronomers in the audience, if there are some, will hopefully recognize that name, very distinguished astrophysicist from at University of California, Santa Cruz. But I can't help but think that Sandy Faber was not one of probably many who were greatly influenced by Cecilia. Because everybody—
Was she a fan of, oh, sorry.
But I'm just going to make the same point again, that people knew what she did that was different from what the computers were doing. She was bringing understanding to this incredible, enormous effort that the computers did. And there are many others, I'm sure, but Sandy Faber's the first one that comes to mind.
Was she a fan of Vermeer?
Another quick answer. I don't know. I don't know. I never came across it, so I kind of doubt it. The fan of Vermeer was Patricia Watwood, the portraitist. That was the key thing here. In fact, it's so interesting. So many things had to fall in place for this book to happen. Patty Watwood had to paint the portrait. David Spergel had to include it in a presentation. I had to see it. So in many ways, that portrait is the genesis of this whole thing. And Patricia Watwood was enamored with Vermeer. But what's really interesting is she didn't base it on any kind of photograph. She took a whole bunch of photographs and made a composite with Vermeer's astronomer in mind as the model.
Do you have any plans of writing a screenplay on Cecilia?
No, but I will tell you, a production company in Los Angeles has started the paperwork for optioning the film rights to the book, which would be incredible. I don't really want to write the screenplay. I'll leave that to others who are better at it than I am. I would like to move on to the next book. But there is, I know the book is going to be optioned. There's a long way from option to screen, as we all know. But that's the first step, and that is in the works, which is very nice. Be very, very good for the book. And I say that not so much. Look, I would love for as many people to read the book as possible, but I don't say that just because, puts money in my pocket. Honestly, that's not why I wrote the book. I wrote it because Cecilia's story deserves to be known and recognized. And a film would obviously aid that.
Do you have inspiration to write about another amazing woman astronomer in your next book?
I've said to myself, be disciplined, be careful. The next idea will come. I don't have it yet, I have to be honest. But I know what it has to have. It has to have an inspirational story, overcoming obstacles, things like that. And, women, just to be honest, just given the position that women are in, they come with those things built in, right? Obstacles and the need to overcome, et cetera. So I'm not trying to limit it to a man or a woman. I don't want to do that, but I do think that it's possible because those dramatic elements are in real life, they're there.
So I think we'll take two more questions.
Sure.
How has astronomy and physics changed for women today? Is the situation improved?
Josh, do you want to handle that one?
Very much so. It's very, very different. And I'm proud to say that astronomy has, I think, led the way in the physical sciences. Much more progress has been made in astronomy, recognizing women becoming graduate students, women becoming professors, than in physics, our closest allied field. I don't want to cast dispersion on my physics colleagues, but I think most would agree that that's what's happened. And right now here in our department at Harvard, more than half of our students, both graduate students and undergraduates, are women, and they're doing extremely well.
It's very nice to hear Josh say that. That's one of the things the main thing I learned from writing this book, and that is be careful what you assume, right? Mm-hmm. The astronomical community back then just assumed that this young woman could not possibly come up with this kind of discovery. So be careful what you assume. I mean, a scientific problem, particularly in astronomy, but other areas of science, a scientific problem doesn't care, frankly, whether you are a man or a woman, you're young, you're old, you're black or white. It doesn't care. All it cares about is, can your mind wrap itself around this particular problem and solve it? And so it's nice to hear Josh say that, because science is an area, you know, pretty objective, where your brain is what matters. And if people do not get the chance to develop to their full potential, then, you know, the world loses, and that's not a good thing. So I'm glad to hear that.
And I think the way you've pointed out all of those obstacles in the book, I mean, I learned a lot from reading the book. I had no idea that, well, I had some idea that things were very difficult, but hearing the accounts of what these distinguished physicists that we all knew about viewed at the time, and the difficulties that were there for Cecilia, was a real eye-opener.
Yeah.
And I think you did an absolutely superb job of weaving that in, not just, you know, overly emphasizing it, but it was at just the right level that it made the story very clear.
Great. Thank you.
Last question for both of you. What inspirations do you draw from Cecilia's work and her story?
Well, that's sort of what I just got through saying, is what drew me to it was exactly that. It was a wonderfully inspiring story. She, as I mentioned in the presentation, had unbelievable obstacles, but she never let up in overcoming them. I use that word relentless, and I know I used it a lot, maybe relentlessly, but she was that. She was determined to understand, to figure out, to explain, to discover. And that is that kind of determination is so inspiring. She once said, I remember reading, she once said that she worked for 72 hours straight one time at the observatory, and she described it as marvelous. Oh, okay. What a wonderful character to write a book about, right? She just, you know, if it was in the way, she went around it. There's another, hold on if I can find it. There's another wonderful quote. Yeah, here it is. It says late in the book, page 249. This is a quote from Cecilia. She says, "The truth will prevail in the end. Nonsense will fall of its own weight by a sort of intellectual law of gravitation." I just loved that. So she was an amazingly wonderful person to write about. Josh, do you want to add to that?
No, I think those are very appropriate last words. I don't want to detract from them, but I agree completely. She was incredible. She really was the birth, in the broadest sense, of astrophysics.
Right, right.
Well, Donovan, we want to thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Josh, my colleagues Mary Claire and Catherine, and Giro Studios. Thank you all for attending tonight. We're wishing you clear skies, and we look forward to seeing you back for our next virtual observatory night on October 15th.
Okay, thank you very much.